Okay, let's unpack this. If you can, just close your eyes for a second and picture New Orleans, say 1853.
Okay.
The Mississippi River is just churning, absolutely packed with these huge steamboats.
Right, a major artery.
Exactly. And you see countless enslaved workers just straining, loading massive bales of cotton, other cargo. And then right there nearby, you've got these well-dressed white men casually socializing. It's such a stark contrast, you know? That image really sums up what we're digging into today.
It absolutely does. The whole economic and social reality in one picture.
So today we're doing a deep dive into the Antebellum South. That's roughly, 1800 to 1860?
Yeah, that's the key period, the era defined by that phrase, cotton is king.
And our mission really is to unravel the economic, the social, the cultural forces tangled up in this period.
And showing how they were just completely tied to the institution of slavery.
Yeah.
Can't separate them.
No, you really can't. We're drawing on a mix of historical texts here, academic work, personal stories to give you a fuller picture.
Trying to get that nuance.
Yeah. Think of this as your shortcut to getting a solid grasp on this really crucial and complex time in American history. You'll get insights that go beyond just the headlines.
Definitely. And it starts with cotton itself. It's kind of amazing how fast it took over.
Right. Like back in 1787, before the Constitution was even ratified, cotton was barely a thing in the U.S.
Almost nothing commercially. But then, especially after the War of 1812, it just exploded.
Pushing aside tobacco, rice, sugar, the traditional Southern cash crop.
It became the commercial crop for the South.
And the scale we're talking about is just mind-boggling. By 1860, the South is producing 2/3 of the entire world's cotton.
2/3. Over 2 billion pounds a year by then. It's staggering.
So what flipped this switch? How did it happen so fast?
Well, a huge part of it was technology. Eli Whitney's cotton gin, 1793.
Ah, the gin, right.
Before that, separating the seeds from the fibers. Incredibly slow, hard work.
Like 1 pound a day per person, maybe?
Something like that by hand. The gin meant one enslaved person could suddenly process 50 pounds a day.
50. Okay, that's a massive leap. A revolutionary device with devastating consequences.
Absolutely. And this huge increase in supply met this incredible global demand.
The Industrial Revolution, right. Textile mills in Britain, Manchester, places like that, and then in the northern U.S. too.
They were hungry for cotton. American slave-grown cotton literally fueled industrialization on both sides of the Atlantic. It's a direct link.
Okay, so demand is soaring, the tech is there. Where does this cotton kingdom actually take root? What did it look like on the ground?
It centered heavily on a specific type of cotton, pitted Gulf cotton.
Pit Gulls?
Yeah, a hybrid strain. It grew really well in different soils, different climates, which meant the Mississippi River Valley became prime cotton territory.
So Louisiana, Mississippi, Arkansas, Tennessee.
Kentucky, Missouri, even Texas, that whole vast region.
And clearing that land, turning forests and swamps into cotton fields, that required labor.
Massive amounts of forced labor. As new slave states joined the Union, planters sent, as the sources say, armies of the enslaved to clear that land.
So much for the Jeffersonian ideal of small farmers.
Completely different reality. This was large-scale agriculture built entirely on enslavement. The work itself was just brutal. Planting in spring.
March, April.
Yeah, then constant tending, weeding, all through the summer heat, April to August.
And then the picking season. That sounds relentless.
It was not just one harvest. They might pick the same fields up to 7 times between August and early winter.
7 times? Wow. And the conditions?
Enslaved workers carried sacks, filled them over and over, often under the eye of a white driver with a whip.
And they had quotas.
Oh, yeah. A good hand might be expected to pick 200 pounds a day. Overseers measured it daily.
And if you didn't make the quota?
Whippings were common. Brutal punishment for falling short.
And the workday didn't even end there, right?
No. Sunrise to sunset in the fields, maybe a 10-minute lunch. Then back to quarters for chores, tending animals.
Just grueling.
Incredibly grueling. Though many enslaved people showed amazing resourcefulness, keeping small gardens or livestock to supplement their food, just to survive.
Okay, so you've picked and ginned all this cotton, 2 billion pounds of it. How do you move it?
That's where the rivers came in. The Mississippi was absolutely vital, an essential water highway.
And the steamboats.
Exactly. Steamboats were the key to the transportation revolution. They could carry huge amounts of freight and navigate shallower waters.
The numbers really tell the story there, don't they?
They do. From just 17 steamboats in 1817 to over 700 by 1837.
Wow.
And by 1860, you've got 3,500 vessels going in and out of New Orleans alone.
Carrying mostly cotton.
Mostly cotton, valued at $220 million back then. That's something like $6.5 billion today.
Just staggering. And New Orleans itself, it exploded.
Totally transformed. Its location was perfect. The cotton boom turned it into this thriving metropolis by 1840.
Holding 12% of the nation's banking capital.
Incredible, right? Culturally diverse, buzzing with activity. Joseph Holt Ingram wrote in 1835 that it rivaled New York in importance.
It's easy to get caught up in that cotton is king idea, the sheer wealth.
It is. But it's crucial to remember the South wasn't operating in isolation. It was surprisingly dependent on other regions.
That's a really important point. They weren't self-sufficient.
Not entirely. A lot of the food for enslaved people, corn, pork, actually came from the West.
Okay.
And everyday goods. Cheap clothing, shoes, even nice things for planters' homes like carpets, lamps, books, mostly made in the North or Europe.
And the planters themselves, borrowing from northern banks, vacationing in northern resorts.
Exactly, Saratoga and Newport. It shows this complex economic web, this interdependence, even amidst growing sectional tension.
Okay, so we've got the economic engine, this massive cotton machine, but we have to talk about the human cost because it all rested on slavery.
Absolutely. And a pivotal moment is the banning of the foreign slave trade in 1808.
Right. Congress acted in 1807. Effective 1808, you'd think that would curtail slavery, but...
Paradoxically, it did the opposite for domestic slavery. It made the enslaved people already in the U.S. vastly more valuable.
How did that work?
Well, tobacco prices were falling in the upper South Virginia, Maryland. Planters there shifted to wheat, which needed less labor.
So they had a surplus of enslaved people in their horrifying calculus.
Precisely. And instead of freeing them, many sold them south into the expanding cotton kingdom where labor demand was immense.
Like sold them down the river, literally sometimes.
Virginia alone sold over 500,000 enslaved people between 1790 and 1859.
500,000 from just one state. That created these huge, brutal slave markets, right? New Orleans?
New Orleans was the largest in the U.S. Natchez, Mississippi was second. Auctions were a daily horror across the South.
Can you even imagine the trauma of that? Being sold like livestock.
It's almost impossible to comprehend. Historians call it one of the largest forced internal migrations anywhere.
What kind of numbers are we talking about, decade by decade?
Between 1820 and 1860, around 200,000 people were sold and moved each decade.
200,000?
Yeah. The total enslaved population ballooned from under 900,000 in 1800 to nearly 4 million by 1860. These are lives, families destroyed.
And the personal stories that survive are just gut-wrenching. Howsam Northup's account.
In 12 years a slave. Yeah. He describes Eliza in the New Orleans market, crying, begging not to be separated from her children, Randall and Emily.
And the trader, Freeman, just threatens her with a whip to shut her up.
Horrifying. Or John Brown's slave life in Georgia. He talks about his mother's inconsolable grief being torn from her family.
And the sheer brutality of the work, the lack of food.
18-hour days, constant floggings, maybe one meal a day under a cruel master.
And we just cannot gloss over the sexual exploitation. It was endemic.
Absolutely not. William J. Anderson writes about a Mississippi enslaver whipping a woman, then raping her, fathering her child. Frederick Douglass wrote about enslavers selling their own children born to enslaved women.
It actively destroyed families, didn't just undermine them.
Completely. Yet, white slaveholders tried to wrap this horror in the language of paternalism.
This idea that they were acting in the enslaved people's best interest, like they were benevolent fathers.
Exactly. Taking responsibility for their care, their morals, it was a self-serving justification. A dehumanizing, traumatizing disaster. A crime against humanity. Plain and simple.
And control was maintained through constant violence and the threat of it?
The threat of sale was maybe the most effective tool, that fear of being separated from everyone you loved.
And the lash, obviously.
Ubiquitous, used to inflict pain, enforce control. It could maim, even kill. And then there was specialized gear.
Like neck braces, chains.
Neck braces, balls and chains, leg irons, special paddles to cause blisters. Tools designed to inflict pain and dehumanize.
Just horrific. And family life was completely unstable.
Totally. Enslaved people couldn't legally marry. Some enslavers allowed unions, maybe thinking it kept people settled or increased births.
But even those unions weren't safe.
Never. Children could be sold away at any moment. Parents had no legal rights, no real control over their family's fates.
Yet, despite all this, people resisted.
Constantly. In ways big and small. Sometimes it was feigning ignorance, accidentally breaking a tool.
Everyday resistance.
Yeah. or more drastic things like poisoning. Sometimes, sadly, informing on others from maybe a slightly better position.
Yeah, it was complex.
And culture became a vital form of resistance too, right? A way to survive.
Absolutely crucial. Parents teaching children how to navigate interactions with white people, be discreet, guarded. Survival skills.
And storytelling.
Hugely important. Tales of tricksters like Brer Rabbit who outsmarted stronger foes. They offered comfort, humor, a sense of agency.
Work songs, too, with hidden meanings.
Definitely. Yeah. Double meanings, one for the overseer, another deeper one for themselves, commenting on their hardship.
And African traditions survived.
Remarkably so. Spiritual practices, the role of healers using herbs, naming patterns, basket weaving, even growing African plants. These connections remain strong.
What about Christianity? Enslavers used it to preach obedience.
They did. But enslaved people often found their own meaning in it, focusing on the message of liberation, of deliverance from bondage, connecting with the Exodus story.
The emotional worship in Methodist and Baptist churches really appealed to them. And spirituals, like Roll, Jordan, Roll.
They weren't just hymns.
No. They expressed hope, pain, the struggle for freedom, often in coded ways their enslavers might not fully grasp.
Now, here's something that might surprise people. The free black population in the South.
Right, it's a bit paradoxical. In 1850, there were actually more free black people in the South than the North.
About 261,000 in the South, 226,000 in the North, mostly Upper South.
Yeah, mainly Upper South. And the reasons for their freedom varied.
Some manumitted after the revolution, that whole all men are created equal idea, may be influencing some.
Possibly. Also, the shift away from tobacco to wheat in the Upper South meant some enslavers freed people they deemed surplus.
Others were free before the Louisiana Purchase or came from places like Cuba or Haiti.
Exactly. It was a diverse group. But even within freedom, there were painful hierarchies.
Based on skin color, terms like mulatto, quadroon.
Yet, lighter skin often conferred higher status within the community. A really unfortunate reflection of the surrounding society's racism.
And very, very rarely, some free black individuals became wealthy, even owned enslaved people themselves.
Extremely rare, but yes. Figures like Andrew Durnford in Louisiana, a sugar planter, or William Ellison in South Carolina.
Who bought his freedom and then made a fortune making cotton gins. And owned enslaved people.
Yes, he became one of the wealthiest enslavers in his state. These are total outliers, but they complicate the narrative.
Absolutely outliers. Because for most free black people, life was incredibly restricted, right?
Severely. Southern states increasingly outlawed manumission, stripped away rights like testifying against whites, choosing jobs.
And the laws were often harshest in the Upper South.
Interestingly, yes. Possibly because slavery was less profitable there, leading to more economic anxiety and tighter controls on the free black population.
So resistance was usually small-scale individual, but what about large-scale revolts?
They were rare. The odds were just stacked so heavily against success, and the consequences of failure were terrifying torture, mass executions.
But the fear of revolt among white Southerners was constant.
Absolutely pervasive. They often imagined plots where none existed, but two major uprisings did happen.
Charles Deslandes in 1811 in Louisiana, inspired by Haiti.
Yes. He led up to 500 enslaved people attacking plantations. It was brutally suppressed. Deslandes was mutilated, executed, others beheaded, their heads put on pikes.
War, horrific warning.
And then Nat Turner in Virginia, 1831.
Deeply religious, motivated by visions and his wife being sold away.
Right. His rebellion killed dozens of white people before it was crushed. The shockwaves were immense.
Virginia's legislature actually debated ending slavery after that, for security.
They did. But ultimately, they decided against it. Shows how deeply committed they were to maintaining the system, even when terrified by it.
Okay, so we've seen the cotton economy, the brutal reality of enslavement. Let's look at the wider Southern society wealth class justifications.
Right, because even with all that cotton wealth, it was incredibly concentrated.
The Mississippi Valley had the most millionaires per capita by 1860.
Yes, but that hid a huge disparity. Only about 3% of white people enslaved more than 50 people.
And 2/3 of white households owned no enslaved people at all.
Wealth was becoming less democratic, more concentrated over time.
Yet for poor white Southerners, owning land and enslaved people was still the goal, the path up.
It was the American dream for them, yeah. The way to achieve status and independence.
At the very top, you had the planter elite, Two groups, kind of.
Broadly, yeah. The older aristocratic gentry in the Upper South, think Nathaniel Hayward with his 1,800 enslaved people.
And the newer Cottonwealth in the Deep South.
People who made fortunes quickly in the boom. Think of Edward Lloyd V in Maryland, inherited wealth, hundreds enslaved, grand plantation.
The one Frederick Douglass described. Beautiful surface, brutal reality underneath.
Precisely. These elites wielded enormous political power, shaping policy to protect and expand slavery. They cultivated this air of refinement, believed manual labor was beneath white people.
And saw slavery as the foundation of their entire civilization.
The bedrock, as they called it. Below them, you had yeoman farmers, small landowners. Then the majority. Poor, landless whites, often working as overseers or traders, aspiring to join the ranks above.
So big class differences, what held them together?
A shared, deeply ingrained belief in white supremacy was key. It kind of smoothed over class tensions.
And that shared fear of slave revolts we talked about.
That too. It created a common cause. Non-slaveholders participated in patrols, juries, civic duties aimed at upholding the system. Your interests aligned on that basic level.
Interesting point about the plantation system being seen as pre-capitalist.
Yeah, some economic historians argue that because it relied on unpaid forced labor, unlike capitalism's free wage labor, more like feudalism in some ways.
And then there was this whole Southern code of honor.
Very important for the white elite. It dictated how gentlemen and ladies should behave, all about appearances, reputation, control over dependents, enslaved people, wives, family.
And insults could lead to duels. Still.
Oh yeah. Dueling persisted much longer in the South than the North. Any perceived slight to one's honor could demand satisfaction, often violently.
That James Wade Hampton scandal is a wild example.
It really is. Ham's affair with Hampton's daughters, Hampton trying to ruin him politically instead of dueling, it broke the code. Shows the complexities and hypocrisies, right? Honor was crucial, but how it played out could be messy and self-serving.
And gender roles were extremely rigid.
Profoundly male-dominated. The planter was the patriarch, the sovereign of his household. White women were ideally confined to the domestic sphere.
Praised for piety, grace, modesty.
Yeah.
Supposed weakness.
Right. Thomas Roderick Dhu, writers like Louisa Cheeves McCord, reinforcing that ideal women's role is to comfort and help, be subservient.
But the reality for white women could be very different.
Absolutely. Their own writings often reveal trauma, childbirth, child loss, intense loneliness on isolated plantations.
And for enslaved women, no protection at all.
None. Forced into backbreaking field labor, constant vulnerability to physical and sexual violence. Their roles as wife, mother, daughter meant nothing legally. They were entirely subject to the enslaver's will.
So, faced with rising abolitionism and fears about democracy, the South built elaborate defenses for slavery.
They really ramped up in this period. Politically, figures like John C. Calhoun were hugely influential.
Arguing the tariff was a Northern attack, pushing states' rights.
And his idea of a concurrent majority, basically giving a regional minority veto power over national legislation to protect slavery, it was deeply anti-democratic.
Then the economic arguments, comparing slavery favorably to Northern wage slavery.
Yes. Claiming enslavers cared for people cradle to grave, unlike Northern capitalists who just exploited workers. George Fitzhugh's Sociology for the South is a prime example.
Arguing enslaved people were like children, better off enslaved.
Exactly. A deeply paternalistic and obviously false argument that they were happier and better cared for than free laborers.
And underpinning all this was scientific racism.
Increasingly prominent. Ideas like polygenism, popularized by people like Harvard's Louis Agassiz.
The theory that races had separate origins, placing black people as inherently inferior.
Yes, arguing black people were a fundamentally separate and inferior race. It gave a pseudoscientific justification for racial hierarchy and enslavement. Some even placed black people between Greeks and chimpanzees. Just appalling stuff used to prop up the system.
Okay, so the defense is hardening, the cotton empire is booming, and the South wants more. Expansion.
Always more. They'd driven previous expansions, Louisiana Purchase, Texas, the Mexican War. Now, the goal was to replicate that, especially in the Caribbean and Central America.
Create an empire of slavery.
That was the dream for many. And one way they pursued it was through filibustering.
These aren't guys delaying legislation. These are private military adventurers.
Men leading unofficial military operations to seize foreign land or start revolutions, often hoping the U.S. would annex the territory later.
Despite laws against it.
Despite federal law, yes. But it was often romanticized as bold American male vigor.
And Cuba was the big prize in the 1850s.
Top of the list. They feared it might become another Haiti, a successful slave revolt, or fall under British influence since Britain had abolished slavery.
Narciso Lopez tried multiple times.
5 times. A Venezuelan adventurer. He led an expedition from New Orleans in 1851, failed, and was executed in Cuba along with some American followers.
But the U.S. government itself got involved secretly. The Ostend Manifesto.
Right, 1854. A secret memo drafted by diplomats, including future President James Buchanan, saying the U.S. should just take Cuba by force if Spain wouldn't sell.
When that leaked, big trouble.
Huge outrage to the North. They saw it as a blatant slave power plot. European powers were furious too.
So the government had to back down.
President Pierce did, yeah.
Yeah.
And Buchanan later denounced filibustering. But the whole episode just deepened the North-South divide.
Cuba wasn't the only target, though. Nicaragua. William Walker.
William Walker, a notorious filibuster. Tennessee-born, he actually took control of Nicaragua in 1855 with just 60 men.
60. Wow. He'd invaded Mexico before that, too.
Briefly, yes. Declared his own Republic of Sonora. Nicaragua was strategic, a potential canal route, transit between oceans.
And Walker actively courted Southern support.
He did. He legalized slavery there in 1856. It had been abolished for 30 years and reopened the slave trade, trying to make it attractive for annexation.
But it didn't last.
No. He angered Cornelius Vanderbilt, faced internal opposition, was driven out in 1857, tried again, got captured by the British, and executed by Honduras in 1860. A pretty dramatic end.
His story really shows the desperation, the lengths some went to expand that slave empire.
It really does. A violent, reckless ambition fueled by the desire to perpetuate slavery.
So as we've seen, this journey through the Antebellum South reveals this incredibly complex and often deeply disturbing reality.
Yet we've tried to go beyond just cotton as king, to see how that dominance was built on stolen labor, on immense human suffering.
We've traced the links between the cotton economy and the brutal domestic slave trade.
And looked at the resilience, the cultural survival of enslaved people against unimaginable odds.
Plus the rigid social structures of the white South, the code of honor, the class dynamics.
And those desperate, sometimes violent efforts to defend and expand the whole system.
As we've explored this whole web, cotton, labor, wealth, power, it just becomes so clear, doesn't it, how profoundly economic systems can mold a society's values, its justifications, everything.
It really makes you think. Consider how this period shows societies, even ones supposedly founded on liberty, constructing these elaborate stories to rationalize brutal exploitation. What lessons can we draw from that for looking at the hidden costs, the ethical basis of economic prosperity in any time?